The first thing to pierce the oppressive, humid dark of the 1838 Kentucky midnight was not the light, but the sound. It was a scream, a sound so primal and full of terror that it seemed to tear the fabric of the night itself. It was followed by another, and then the guttural, horrifying cry of horses. Only then did the neighbors, nestled in their isolated cabins in the hollow, see the glow. The old McClenny barn on the edge of the Sparrow property was not just burning, it was an inferno. A column of angry, orange light punched a hole in the blackness, vomiting thick, oily smoke into the stars. The air, usually thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, was choked with the acrid stench of burning hay, old wood, and something else. Something deeply, sickeningly wrong. A smell like roasted meat, a macabre perfume that clung to the back of the throat and signaled a forbidden kind of horror. The neighbors who rushed to the scene, their feet bare on the cold dirt path, were too late. The barn's roof was already collapsing, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the air, a hellish cathedral disintegrating into the night. They brought buckets, but it was a useless gesture. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on a wagon 50 yards away. But it wasn't the heat that stopped them dead in their tracks. It wasn't the size of the fire or the terrifying, inevitable loss of the structure. It was the realization that the screams had stopped, and that the heavy main door, the only large exit, was still closed. The fire was a living, breathing monster. It roared with a voice that drowned out the frantic shouts of the gathered townsfolk. The main barn door, made of thick-planked oak, was a wall of rippling, blistering heat. As the men approached, shielding their faces, they saw it, and the sight turned their blood to ice. It was not the fire that kept the door shut. It was the heavy iron locking bar. It was dropped firmly in place, secured in its brackets. From the outside, this was not an accident. This was not a misplaced lantern or a stray spark from a forge. This was a cage, a tomb. The horrifying implications settled over the crowd like a funeral shroud. The men inside, and they knew there were men inside, for the town's two most prominent young bachelors, Thomas Vance and James Croft, had been seen heading this way, had been trapped. They had been sealed inside a tinderbox, left to burn alive. The realization was so disturbing, so profoundly evil, that the men with the buckets simply stood and stared, paralyzed by the macabre spectacle. The barn was no longer a building. It was a premeditated crime scene, an altar for a dark and terrible sacrifice. The flames reached their zenith, turning the night sky a sickly, pulsating red. And as the structure groaned its final complaint and the main beam gave way, the crowd took an involuntary step back, not just from the heat, but from the sheer, horrifying weight of the sin that had just been committed in their quiet, God-fearing valley. It was then that someone saw her. Standing just beyond the ring of light, almost invisible in the shadow of a massive, ancient oak tree, was Elspeth Sparrow. She was 17. The daughter of Silas Sparrow, the reclusive, strange man who owned the land, Elspeth was a creature of local rumor. Known for her unsettling beauty and a silence that many mistook for madness, she was an outcast in a community that feared what it could not understand. And now she was watching the inferno. She wore a simple white nightgown, her long, dark hair unbound and catching the demonic flicker of the firelight. She was not crying, she was not screaming. She was not like the others, frozen in horror. Her face, pale and smooth as porcelain, was utterly serene, blank. Her eyes were fixed on the heart of the fire, watching as the last of the roof caved in, as if she were merely observing a passing storm. One of the women, a Mrs. Gable, pointed a trembling finger. "It's the girl," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Sweet Lord preserve us, she's watching it." The accusation hung in the smoke-filled air. Elspeth Sparrow did not move. She did not look at them. She just stood there, a ghostly figure illuminated by the roaring funeral pyre of the men who, just hours before, had been vying for her attention. The girl who had trapped her suitors. The central, horrifying mystery of that night had just taken human form. To understand the horror of 1838, one must first understand the place. This was not the genteel, columned Kentucky of bluegrass and horse farms. This was Barren Creek, a deep, claw-like valley carved into the rugged Appalachian foothills. It was a place of shadow and stone, where the hills crowded so close together that the sun only touched the valley floor for a few hours a day. It was 1838, but in Barren Creek, it could have been 1738. The people here were isolated, bound by blood, hard work, and a deep, pervasive superstition. They were settlers on the edge of a frontier that was still wild and unforgiving. They believed in signs, in omens, and in the power of curses. They saw the devil in the twisted branches of a dead tree and heard forbidden whispers in the rustle of the corn. This was a place where folklore was as real as the Bible, and often the two were indistinguishable. Justice was swift, personal, and often handled with a rope or a rifle, far from the reach of any distant county judge. Into this claustrophobic, paranoid world, the Sparrow family had arrived 5 years prior, shrouded in mystery. They were not from here, and in Barren Creek, not from here was a sin second only to witchcraft. They kept to themselves, and the valley interpreted their silence as arrogance, and their privacy as the concealment of dark secrets. The Sparrow family consisted of two, Silas and Elspeth. Silas Sparrow was a tall, gaunt man with eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. He spoke only when necessary, buying seed and salt at the crossroads store with a handful of coins and a curt nod. He farmed a rocky patch of land that no one else had wanted, living in a cabin set so far back into the woods it was almost an act of defiance. Rumors, of course, were the primary currency of Barren Creek. Some said Silas was a disgraced preacher, banned from his last congregation. Others whispered he was a Yankee abolitionist, a truly dangerous accusation in 1838 Kentucky. The most macabre rumor was that he was running from a dark past, a crime so terrible he had to flee to the one place he knew no one would follow. His daughter, Elspeth, was the valley's true enigma. She had arrived as a child and blossomed into a young woman of strange, almost unnatural beauty. It was not a wholesome, rosy-cheeked beauty. It was sharp, pale, and ethereal. She had the black hair of her father and eyes the color of a winter sky. She was rarely seen, and when she was, she moved with a silent, feline grace that the local boys found both terrifying and irresistible. She was, in every sense, the forbidden fruit of Barren Creek. The locals called it the Sparrow Curse. It was a term whispered over fences and in the pews of the small, unpainted church. It was said that misfortune followed the family like a shadow. Their well produced the sweetest water, yet the neighbors' cattle that drank from the runoff mysteriously sickened. The wildflowers that grew on their property were said to be poisonous, and the birds in the trees around their cabin were unnervingly silent. Elspeth was the focal point of this dark folklore. Animals, it was said, reacted strangely to her. Dogs would either cower or bare their teeth, hackles raised. Horses would shy and rear if she came too near. Goody Miller, the town's self-proclaimed midwife and healer, claimed Elspeth was touched, that she had been born with a veil over her face, a sure sign of a walker between worlds. This reputation, this aura of the forbidden, only amplified her allure. She was the dark, dangerous mystery in a world of monotonous, backbreaking labor. The young men of the valley didn't just desire her, they saw her as a challenge, a peak to be conquered. They mistook her silence for innocence and her isolation for loneliness. They were, to a man, catastrophically wrong. They failed to see that a creature raised in shadow does not fear the dark, it commands it, and they were about to learn the horrifying cost of trespassing. The two men who met their end in the macabre inferno of the McClenny barn were Thomas Vance and James Croft. They were, by Barren Creek standards, the suitors of the legend. Thomas Vance was the only son of the valley's wealthiest landowner. He was arrogant, handsome, and accustomed to getting precisely what he wanted. He saw Elspeth Sparrow not as a person, but as the ultimate prize, a wild thing he could tame and show off, a testament to his own prowess. James Croft was different, and perhaps more dangerous. He was a newcomer, a drifter with a quick smile and a dark reputation. He worked as a hired hand and was known for his silver tongue, his skill with a knife, and the unsettling rumor that he had left a dead man behind in Tennessee. Croft was drawn to Elspeth's darkness, seeing in her a reflection of his own fractured, volatile nature. These two men were bitter rivals, not just for Elspeth, but in the small, testosterone-fueled arena of their isolated world. They had come to blows more than once at the local tavern, their enmity a public spectacle. Why, then, were they in the same barn, at the same time, on the same night? The official story, the one that would be pieced together in the horrified whispers of the following days, was that Elspeth had been toying with them both. That she had, in a fit of cruel, sociopathic coquetry, promised to meet them, perhaps playing one against the other. The night before the fire had been the quarterly barn dance at the Gable farm. It was the sauce event of the season, a rare chance for the scattered families of the Hollow to gather, and for the first time in memory, Sela's sparrow had allowed Elspeth to attend. She had appeared in the doorway like an apparition, wearing a simple dark blue dress that made her pale skin seem to glow. The fiddler's music seemed to falter for a moment. The entire room stopped. Elspeth, who was usually a ghost, was suddenly, vividly real, and she was magnetic. Thomas Vance had immediately claimed her for a dance, his ownership as public and arrogant as a brand. Then James Croft had cut in, a dangerous glint in his eye, and the two had nearly come to blows right there on the dance floor. Elspeth, the epicenter of this storm, had simply watched them, her expression unreadable. She danced with both, her movements fluid and graceful, yet her eyes remained cold, detached, as if she were a biologist studying two base creatures. The tension was palpable, a thick, static dread that charged the air. The older women clucked their tongues, declaring no good will come of this. They saw a young girl in over her head, a victim caught between two aggressive, posturing males. They could not have possibly imagined the truth. They were not watching a sheep caught between two wolves. They were watching a spider, observing two flies as they blundered toward her web. When the sun rose on Barren Creek, it revealed a scene of pure, unadulterated horror. The McClenny barn was gone, reduced to a smoking 4-acre patch of black skeletal ruin. The smell of death was overwhelming, a putrid, lingering miasma that caused even the strongest-willed men to retch. The sheriff, Hiram Brody, had arrived from the county seat, a grim-faced, practical man who was utterly unprepared for what he found. The townsfolk were gathered at a distance, a silent, watchful gallery. Under Brody's direction, the men began the macabre task of excavation. They used rakes and shovels, pulling back the still-hot, twisted metal and charred beams. What they found would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. They found the horses first, or what was left of them, fused masses of bone and incinerated flesh. Then, near the barred main door, they found the Suitors. They were barely recognizable as human. The fire had been so hot it had effectively rendered them down to their composite parts. Blackened bones, scraps of melted metal buttons, and a few, horrifyingly preserved teeth. The two bodies were tangled together, locked in a final, desperate embrace, as if in their last moments they had sought comfort from their rival. Or, as one man darkly speculated, as if they had been fighting even as the flames consumed them. The discovery was grotesque, a truly disturbing end to their bitter rivalry. But the horror was only just beginning. Sheriff Brody was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the frontier. He understood violence. He understood greed, and he understood passion. He did not understand this. This was something else. This was ritualistic. It was cold. He walked from the smoking pit of the barn to the great oak tree where Elspeth's sparrow had been seen standing. He found her there still. She had not moved. She was sitting now, her back against the trunk, her white nightgown stained with soot and dew. She was humming, a simple, tuneless melody like a child humming to a doll. The sight of it, the sheer wrongness of it, made the hair on Brody's arm stand on end. "Miss Sparrow," he said, his voice rough. Elspeth slowly looked up. Her eyes were clear, the color of the morning sky. There was no fear in them, no grief, no shock. It was, Brody would later report, like looking into the eyes of something not entirely human. "Did you see what happened here, girl?" he asked. Elspeth tilted her head, considering the question as if he had asked her about the weather. "They're gone," she said, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. "They were loud, and now they are quiet." The simplicity of the statement, the chilling detachment, was more damning than any confession. This was not the response of a traumatized victim. It was the observation of an exterminator. Brody, a man who had fought in skirmishes with the Shawnee, felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. Sheriff Brody took Elspeth and her father, Silas, into the town's small, one-room jail for questioning. Silas was as silent and imposing as ever, his face a granite mask. He answered every question with a simple, "My daughter is not well. She is afflicted by a nervous disposition." But Elspeth was different. She was not silent. She was helpful, too helpful. She recounted the night with a lucid, almost poetic calm. Yes, she said, Thomas Vance and James Croft had been bothering her. They had both followed her from the dance, refusing to leave her be. They were arguing, she claimed, over her. Like two dogs over a bone, she said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. She told Brody. She had been frightened and had run to the old barn to hide. They had followed her in, their voices raised, threatening each other, threatening her. I slipped out the back, she explained, her gaze steady and unwavering. Through the gap in the wall where the pigs get in. I ran, I heard a lantern crash. They were fighting, Sheriff, they were so angry. Her story was plausible, it was neat. It covered everything. And yet it was utterly, terrifyingly unbelievable. She told it like a story she had read, not a horror she had lived. And she had no answer, none at all, for the one question that mattered. If they were fighting inside, who had barred the door from the outside? The town of Barren Creek did not wait for a trial. It did not need one. Their verdict was instantaneous and unanimous. Elspeth Sparrow was a witch. The evidence was all around them, in the failed crops of those who crossed her, in the sickness of the cattle, and now in the smoldering, ashen graves of two of their own. This was not a crime of passion. It was a work of dark, forbidden magic. The whispers that had once followed her now became a roar. Goody Miller, the midwife, was suddenly the town's most important resident, her status elevated to that of a folk expert. She recounted tales of seeing Elspeth in the woods, gathering herbs at midnight, speaking in a language that was not of God. She claimed the girl could call animals, that she had seen a fox eat from her hand. The preacher, Reverend Sykes, delivered a blistering sermon that Sunday, his voice thundering against the evils of the heathen in their midst, the Jezebel who walked in shadow. The story of the burning barn was already becoming a legend, a macabre piece of local folklore. And it needed a villain. The terrified, superstitious people of Barren Creek, faced with an act of such cold, calculated cruelty, found it easier to believe in a supernatural monster than a human one. It was simpler to believe she was a witch, because the alternative, that a 17-year-old girl was capable of such horrifying, meticulous evil, was simply too disturbing to comprehend. As the town spun its tales of witchcraft, Sheriff Brody was digging into something more tangible. He was a man who believed in evidence, not curses. And Elspeth's story, her neat little tale of an accident, had a hole in it, a very large one. While interviewing the townsfolk, a new name had surfaced, one spoken only in hushed, fearful tones. Elias Reed. He was a young man, a trapper, who had been sweet on Elspeth Sparrow. Sweet on her in a way the other boys were not. He was quiet like her. He spent his time in the woods like her. He was, by all accounts, the only person in the valley who Elspeth seemed to genuinely talk to. And Elias Reed had vanished. He had been gone for 3 weeks. The initial assumption was that he had simply moved on, following the trap lines west. But now, in the horrifying light of the barn fire, his disappearance felt different. It felt connected, ominous. A cold dread settled on Brody. This was not the beginning of something. This was the end of something. The burning of Vance and Croft was not the first act. It was the horrifying, explosive finale. He was not investigating a single, macabre crime. He was standing at the edge of a graveyard, and he was only seeing the 2 most recent stones. This was now, in his mind, a cold case, a case that had just turned red hot. Sheriff Brody, armed with a warrant and a deep sense of foreboding, rode out to the Sparrow property. He was going to search the cabin. Silas Sparrow protested, his voice low and threatening, but Brody was unfazed. He stepped across the threshold and into the heart of the Sparrow's world. The cabin was just 2 rooms, but it was unnervingly clean. Sterile. The floor was swept, the single table scrubbed, the meager bedding folded. But it was the air that was wrong. It was thick with the smell of dried herbs, a pungent, cloying aroma that hung in the air. Hundreds of bundles of plants hung from the rafters, lavender, mugwort, nightshade, and others Brody couldn't identify. It looked less like a home and more like an apothecary. In the corner on a small shelf were Elspeth's dolls. They were not dolls at all, but small, disquieting figures woven from corn husks, straw, and bits of dark, matted fur. Some had buttons for eyes, others had nothing, just a blank, featureless head. It was creepy, the kind of folk art that borders on the occult. But the most disturbing discovery was in the back room, Elspeth's room. On a small, whittled wood table lay a single object, a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary. Brody opened it and his blood ran cold. It was not filled with a young girl's dreams. It was filled with lists, names, dates, and alongside the names, sketches of plants. The mystery of Elspeth Sparrow was inextricably linked to the mystery of her mother, Abigail. Abigail Sparrow had vanished 3 years prior, just 2 years after the family arrived in Barren Creek. The story Silas told was that she had wandered into the woods to gather mushrooms and had simply never returned. He declaimed the woods had taken her. A mountain lion, perhaps, or she had fallen into a ravine. No body was ever found. The valley, however, had its own, more sinister theory. They whispered that Silas, in a fit of rage, had killed her and buried her in an unmarked grave deep in the unforgiving forest. They said he was a Bluebeard, a man who consumed his wives. The disappearance had cemented the Sparrow family's status as dark omens. But now, Sheriff Brody looked at this cold case with new, horrified eyes. Elspeth had lost her mother. Had she lost her, or had she watched her be taken? What does a child, raised in silence and shadow by a man rumored to be a killer, become? Does she become a victim, forever silent? Or does she become a predator, learning the family trade? The woods around the Sparrow cabin suddenly seemed infinitely darker, a place where secrets didn't just die, they were actively buried. The line between victim and perpetrator, between madness and calculated evil, was becoming horrifyingly blurred. Abigail Sparrow's vanishing act was not a separate tragedy. It was the prologue to this entire, macabre story. This new, terrifying context reframed everything the town knew about Elspeth. The Sparrow curse was suddenly more than just folklore. It was a potential trail of bodies. Brody began asking different questions, and the answers were disturbing. He spoke to the Gables, their nearest neighbors. Mrs. Gable recalled an incident a year prior. Their prize-winning rooster, a creature known for its aggressive, territorial nature, had taken to harassing Elspeth when she walked the property line. Elspeth had simply stared at it, unflinching, as it flapped and crowed at her feet. The next morning the rooster was found dead, its body stiff, its eyes open with no mark upon it. At the time they called it a freak occurrence. Now it felt like a warning. Then there was the story of the neighbor's dog, a hound that had supposedly barked incessantly at the Sparrow cabin. It was found a week later, poisoned. And the well at the old Miller farm, which had suddenly, inexplicably gone bad, tasting of bitter almonds, just days after old man Miller had tried to shortchange Silas on a grain deal. These were small, isolated accidents, rural misfortunes. But when laid end to end, they formed a chilling, disturbing pattern. It was a pattern of retribution. A quiet, lethal justice meted out by a silent, watchful girl. The men in the barn weren't the first. They were just the loudest. The more Brody learned, the less Elspeth's story held up. The idea that two men like Thomas Vance and James Croft, a wealthy heir and a hardened drifter, would accidentally kill themselves while fighting over a girl was absurd. They were rivals, yes, but they were also experienced, capable men. The fire was too hot, too fast. It spoke of an accelerant, it spoke of planning, and the sheer mechanics of the trap. It was this that truly chilled the sheriff. The McClenny barn was old, but the locking bar was heavy. It was a solid piece of iron that required significant strength to lift and drop into place. This wasn't the work of a panicked girl. This was the work of a determined, cold-blooded executioner. And the question still remained, why? Why them? Why then? What had they done to warrant such a horrifying, macabre fate? The town had accepted the spurned lover theory, but it felt thin. Elspeth had shown no romantic interest in anyone, save perhaps the vanished Elias Reed. Brody began to suspect the suitor narrative was a lie A simple story to cover a far more complex and disturbing truth. Vance and Croft were not in that barn because they desired Elspeth. They were in that barn because Elspeth wanted them there. They had been summoned, lured, and the bait, Brody suspected, had nothing to do with love. If you are finding this history as disturbing as the residents of Barren Creek did, and you want to ensure you don't miss any of our explorations into the most forbidden, banned, and macabre cold cases, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. The archives of history are filled with stories like Elspeth's, stories that were deliberately buried, stories that the powerful tried to erase. We dig them up. And the story of Elspeth Sparrow is far from over because the true motive, the one that the town was too terrified to even consider, was about to be unearthed. The sheriff was piecing it together, the herbs, the accidents, the missing mother, the vanished boy Elias Reed, and the two charred bodies in the barn. These were not separate incidents. They were all connected, part of a single, horrifying narrative. Brody was no longer just investigating a fire. He was investigating a serial killer. A quiet, meticulous killer who had been operating in their midst for years. Using the valley's own superstition as a shield. Elspeth wasn't a witch. She was something far more terrifying. She was methodical, and she was, Brody realized, still out there. The town was locked in a panic, but they were afraid of the wrong thing. They were afraid of a supernatural curse when they should have been afraid of the girl next door. Sheriff Brody returned to the burned-out shell of the barn. He stood where the door had been, imagining the scene. He saw Elspeth, a phantom in the dark. He saw her lift the heavy bar. He saw her douse the kindling. He was reconstructing the crime, but the why was still a gaping hole. It was then that Deputy Oakes, a young, nervous man, approached him, holding a small, soot-covered object in a rag. "Sheriff," he stammered, "we found this in the ash near where the bodies were." It was a hip flask, silver, with the initials TV engraved on it, Thomas Vance's, but it wasn't the flask that was important. It was what was next to it. Oakes held up another, more mundane object, the metal frame of a small, burned-out lantern. This was the crashed lantern from Elspeth's story, but the discovery was a contradiction. If the men were fighting and knocked over one lantern, it would start a fire, yes. But the intensity of this blaze, the speed at which it consumed the entire structure, suggested something more. It suggested the entire barn had been pre-soaked. The hay, the stalls, the very walls themselves. The oil hadn't just been in the lantern, it had been everywhere. This was a bomb, not an accident. The planning was meticulous. The execution flawless. The girl had not just trapped them. She had prepared the barn like a Dutch oven, designed for the sole purpose of incinerating its contents. The level of premeditation was horrifying. The vanished trapper, Elias Reed, this was the key. Brody was sure of it. He began to ask about Reed not as a vanished person but as a victim. He learned that Reed was the antithesis of Vance and Croft. He was quiet, introspective, and respected the woods. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely kind soul in a harsh land. And he and Elspeth had been seen together, multiple times, walking the high ridges, not as lovers in the traditional sense, but as peers. As two similar, quiet creatures who had found a rare kinship. And then 3 weeks ago he was gone. Brody went back to the only person who might have seen Reed last, Goody Miller, the old woman who lived in a shack on the edge of the Sparrow property. He found her rocking on her porch, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You're asking about the wrong fire, Sheriff," she cackled, her voice like dry leaves. "You're asking about the end of the story." Brody, frustrated, asked her what she meant. "That boy Reed," she said, spitting tobacco juice onto the dirt. "He was the only one who wasn't afraid of her, and he was the only one she wasn't afraid of. The other two, Vance and Croft, they were afraid of what that boy knew." Brody froze. "Knew about what?" Goody Miller smiled, a horrifying, toothless expression. "About them, Sheriff, about what they done." The role of Silas Sparrow in this macabre play was a mystery Brody couldn't solve. Was he an accomplice? A puppet master who had trained his daughter in his own dark arts? Or was he simply a broken man, a prisoner of his terrifying, silent daughter? Brody confronted him again in the jail cell. Silas sat on the cot, his hands clasped, a statue of patriarchal gloom. "Your daughter is a killer, Silas," Brody said flatly. Silas looked up, his dark eyes burning with a cold fire. "My daughter," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is a creature of consequence. You plant corn, you get corn. You plant evil, you get a harvest." It was a non-confession, a cryptic, biblical threat that was more terrifying than a denial. He was not protecting Elspeth from the law. He was protecting the law from Elspeth. He was a man who had long ago made peace with the monster in his house, or perhaps had cultivated it. He showed no grief for the dead, no fear of the law. Only a strange, disturbing sense of pride. He was the gardener of a poison plant, and he seemed, in his own dark way, to be admiring his work. Brody realized with a jolt that Silas wasn't Elspeth's keeper. It was the other way around. The valley had been afraid of the wrong sparrow all along. Silas wasn't the monster. He was just the monster's father. The horror of the Kentucky barn burning, as the papers in Lexington would later call it, was not just the crime itself, but the way it infected the local culture. It became a forbidden story, a macabre legend told to frighten children and drunkards. Within a year, a ballad had emerged, a haunting, minor-key dirge called The Sparrow Witch of Barren Creek. It told the story of a beautiful, dark-haired witch who lured men to their doom with eyes of ice and a voice of sin. It spoke of their screams, the smell of their burning flesh, and the devil's daughter who watched and hummed. The song became so popular and so disturbing that it was actively banned by the local preacher. He claimed that singing it was an invitation to the devil, that it glorified a sin so profound it could call the curse down upon their own homes. But banning the song only gave it more power. It became a secret anthem of the Hollow, a piece of forbidden history that defined them. The song was a way to process the unprocessed horror, to file the sharp edges of the crime down into a familiar, rhyming narrative. It was easier to sing about a witch than to talk about the horrifying, calculated, and all too human rage that had led a teenage girl to commit an act of such unspeakable, fiery vengeance. Sheriff Brody was done with rumor and he was done with folklore. He needed the truth, and the truth, he was now certain, was buried in the ground. He organized a search party, not for a living Elias Reed, but for his body. He started in the woods behind the Sparrow cabin, a place the townsfolk avoided, a place they considered cursed. For 2 days they found nothing but arrowheads and snake dens. The men were about to give up, their fear of the cursed woods overriding their duty. But Brody pressed on, driven by a singular obsessive need. On the 3rd morning, one of the men's dogs, a lean hunting hound, began to whine and paw at a patch of soft earth under a cluster of wild rhododendrons not 50 yards from the Sparrow's property line. The spot was unremarkable, just a slight depression in the forest floor, but the dog was insistent. "Start digging," Brody ordered, his voice grim. The men hesitated, their faces pale. This felt like a desecration. "Now," Brody commanded. They plunged their shovels into the damp, loamy soil. They didn't have to dig far. The smell hit them first, the sweet, sickly stench of decay, masked by the heavy, pungent perfume of the wildflowers that had been deliberately planted on the grave. What they unearthed was the key to the entire horrifying puzzle. It was the body of Elias Reed. He had been dead for weeks, his body partially preserved by the cool, damp earth. He had not been shot or stabbed. His neck, however, was broken, and his face was a mask of brutal, blunt-force trauma, as if he had been beaten with a rock or a log. He had been murdered savagely and then buried in this shallow, hidden grave. But it was the object clutched in his stiff, decaying right hand that made Sheriff Brody's blood freeze. It was a single, dark object, almost invisible in the mud until he cleaned it. A woman's hair comb. It was carved from dark wood in a distinct, unusual pattern. A pattern Brody had seen before. It was lying on the small table in Elspeth Sparrow's room, right next to her diary. This was not a random act of violence. This was a connection. Elias Reed had not just been with Elspeth. He had been killed near her. And now Brody had the final missing piece. He had the motive. And it was a motive not of love, but of pure, cold, horrifying justice. The barn fire was not the crime. It was the punishment. The story was now complete. Brody could see it, a horrifying, macabre tableau. He walked back to the jail, the wooden comb heavy in his pocket, the evidence of a world of darkness. He stood before Elspeth Sparrow's cell. She was sitting on the cot just as her father was, a perfect mirrored image of stillness. "Elias Reed," Brody said. Her name was the only sound in the cell. For the first time, Elspeth's mask of serene detachment cracked. Her eyes, those cold, winter sky eyes, flickered. A single, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to, Brody knew. He laid the comb on the table between them. "He's found," Brody said. "Under the rhododendrons, we found him." Elspeth looked at the comb and then at Brody. The blankness was gone, replaced by an emotion he could not name. It was not grief, it was not relief, it was finality, the look of a project completed. "They were animals," she whispered, her first unsolicited words. "They did it, Vance and Croft." Brody felt a cold sickness rise in his stomach. He had been looking for a witch, but he had found a judge, jury, and executioner. The truth was so much darker than the folklore. Elspeth began to talk, and the story she told was more macabre than any ballad. Elias Reed was not her suitor, he was her only friend, the one person in the hollow who saw her as a human. And Thomas Vance and James Croft, drunk on moonshine and arrogance, had seen their friendship as an insult. They saw Elias as a squirrely, low-class rival who had won the prize they felt entitled to. One night 3 weeks ago, they had cornered Elias in the woods. They hadn't meant to kill him, perhaps. They had only meant to teach him a lesson, to scare him away from Elspeth. But their casual, brutish cruelty had escalated as it always does. They had beaten him, and when he back, they had beaten him until he was still. Elspeth, who had been meeting Elias, had seen the end of it. She had hidden in the trees, a silent, terrified witness, as the two men, panicked, had dragged Elias' body to a soft patch of earth and buried him, laughing nervously as they did, calling him Elspeth's lover even in death. They had even pocketed his hand-carved comb as a trophy. They had no idea she was watching. They had no idea they had just signed their own, horrifying death warrants. For 3 weeks Elspeth had planned. This was not a crime of passion, it was a work of art, a meticulous, horrifying masterpiece of revenge. She had harvested the herbs, the ones that would create a thick, acrid smoke. She had stolen lamp oil day by day, caching it in the abandoned McClenny barn. She had studied the locking bar, testing its weight, practicing the movement in the dark. She was, as her father had said, a creature of consequence. She was the harvest of their evil. Then she had set her trap. She used the one thing she knew they were obsessed with, herself. She had gone to the barn dance, a deliberate public appearance. She had danced with them both, the killers of her only friend, her face a mask of cold porcelain. The town saw a girl in over her head. They were really watching a predator isolating her prey. She had told Thomas Vance to meet her in the barn at midnight, promising him what he had always wanted. And she had told James Croft the exact same thing. She knew their arrogance, their rivalry. She knew they would both show up, and she knew that upon finding each other, their first instinct would be confusion and then anger. She gave them just enough time to realize they had been played. The climax of the story, the true, horrifying climax, was not the fire. It was the conversation through the door. Elspeth recounted it to Sheriff Brody with the same chilling calm she had used to describe the accident. She had lured them inside, then slipped out, barring the heavy door. They had laughed at first, thinking it a game. Then the smell of the oil, the acrid smoke from the kindling she had lit. Panic. They had thrown themselves against the door, the wood groaning, but the iron bar held. Elspeth. They had screamed, their voices muffled. "Let us out, this isn't funny." And then her voice, as cold and clear as a winter night, cut through the darkness. "This is for Elias," she had said. The screaming had changed then. It had lost its arrogance, its anger, and become the high-pitched, primal terror of animals realizing they are in a trap. They had begged, they had prayed, they had cursed her. Elspeth had simply stood by her oak tree listening. She had listened to them find the horses, listened to the animals' terrified cries. She had listened to them fight each in their final, desperate, smoke-filled moments. She had listened until the roar of the fire was the only sound left. Sheriff Brody was left with an impossible, disturbing moral quandary. He had a confession, he had a motive, he had the bodies. He had in Elspeth Sparrow a mass murderer. And yet the entire valley saw her as a victim of a curse or a supernatural entity. And worse, he had in Vance and Croft two victims who were also undeniably savage murderers themselves. This was not a case of black and white, of good and evil. This was a case of shades of black. It was a story of frontier justice, so primal and so terrible it defied the simple classification of law. He had a duty to arrest her, to take her to the county seat for trial. But a trial would mean unearthing the story of Elias Reed. It would mean exposing the valley's two most prominent families, the Vances and the Crofts, for James's family had connections, as the progenitors of killers. The town, he knew, would not stand for it. They preferred their comforting, macabre folktale of the Sparrow Witch to the horrifying, sordid truth of their own son's brutality. The truth was too messy, it was too disturbing, and it would tear Barren Creek apart. The story of the barn burning, the one you think you know, is the one the town chose to tell. It's the story of a witch, a curse, and a forbidden act of supernatural horror. It's the story that became a band ballad. But the true story, the cold case that Sheriff Brody had uncovered, was buried. If you find this descent into the real, macabre heart of history compelling, and you want to support our mission to unearth these forbidden truths, consider subscribing or leaving a comment below. The stories we are told are often a pale shadow of the horrifying, complex reality. What we found in the archives, in the letters of Sheriff Brody himself, reveals what happened next, and it is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire affair. Because justice in 1838 Kentucky did not always look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looked like an escape. Sometimes it looked like a vanishing. Brody knew he had to act. He had to be. Ring in the girl. He had to face the consequences, whatever they may be. He was a man of the law, but Elspeth Sparrow was a creature of the Hollow, and the Hollow has its own rules. That night Sheriff Brody made his decision. He would arrest Elspeth at dawn. He would take her and her father, Silas, in chains. He would bring the whole dark, twisted story to the light of a courtroom. He sat in his office, cleaning his pistol, the single carved hair comb sitting on his desk, a silent testament to the night's horrors. But as the first gray light of dawn touched the misty peaks of Barren Creek, a young boy came running, breathless, to the sheriff's office. It was Jed, the Gable boy. Had been sent to the Sparrow cabin on an errand. "Sheriff," he panted, his eyes wide with fear. "They're gone." Brody rushed to the jail. The cell, which had been left unguarded, was empty, but it had not been a breakout. The lock was not broken, it was unlocked. Silas and Elspeth were gone. Brody rode like a madman to the Sparrow cabin, but he already knew what he would find. The cabin was empty. The door was wide open, swinging in the morning breeze. The herb bundles were still hanging from the rafters. The creepy corn-husk dolls were still on their shelf, but the Sparrows, Silas and Elspeth, had vanished. They had not taken a wagon, the tracks would have been seen. They had not taken horses, they had simply disappeared, as if the dark, misty woods they had lived in for so long had finally, truly swallowed them. They had taken nothing but the clothes on their backs. It was a complete and total vanishing. Sheriff Brody organized a posse, but it was a half-hearted effort. The men were terrified. They were searching for a witch who had already killed two men with fire and they now whispered had murdered her own friend in the woods. They were not tracking a girl, they were tracking a phantom. They did not want to find her. After 3 days, the search was officially called off. The Sparrows were declared vanished, likely taken by the same unforgiving wilderness that had claimed Abigail Sparrow years before. But Brody knew better. This was not a flight of panic. This was a calculated escape. Just like the fire, it had been planned. Silas and Elspeth had not just been sitting in that jail cell, they had been waiting for the story of Elias Reed to be confirmed, for the final piece of their macabre puzzle to be put in place. They had not been prisoners. They had been hosts, waiting for the party to be over. Aftermath in Barren Creek was one of profound collective silence. The Vance family, stripped of their arrogant air, fell into ruin. The whispers about what really happened to Elias Reed were too strong, and their name was now synonymous with a dark, brutish murder. The Sparrow cabin was left to rot. No one dared touch it. No one dared claim the land. Children who threw rocks at its windows were said to be struck with fevers. It became a taboo place, a monument to the valley's dark, unresolved sin. The barn was never rebuilt. The 4 acres of blackened earth were simply plowed over, but the crops, it was said, would never grow there. The soil was soured, cursed by the ashes of the dead. The story of Elspeth Sparrow became the valley's defining, horrifying ghost story. The Sparrow Witch was no longer a person but a force, a cautionary tale. A dark spirit that, it was whispered, still haunted the high ridges, a pale girl in a white dress, watching and humming her tuneless, creepy melody. She was the vengeance of the hollow, the personification of the dark, cold justice that the frontier demanded. This horrifying cold case from 1838 Kentucky leaves us with no easy answers. It is a story where there are no heroes, only villains and victims, and the line between them is hopelessly, terribly blurred. Was Elspeth Sparrow a sociopathic monster, a witch who murdered for sport? Or was she the inevitable product of a brutal, violent world? Was she a grieving friend driven to madness, who enacted a terrible biblical-scale revenge on the men who had destroyed the one good thing in her life? The law never got its say. The town, in its fear, chose to believe in a curse rather than confront the disturbing, macabre reality of their own capacity for violence. And so, Elspeth Sparrow remains forever a ghost. She vanished from the record, from history, leaving only a smoking, haunted ruin and a forbidden ballad. She is a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those from folklore, but those who walk among us, their faces pale and serene, their hearts full of a cold, meticulous, and horrifying fire.